Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest news and reports from the Russo-Ukrainian war with major developments in this one. Starting out in the direction of Kupiansk, we see here that the Russian forces managed to take back some territory that the Ukrainians captured here in the month of November. So on the 1st of December, we're seeing some Russian attacks here in the northern front by the Kupiansk direction. We also see this image here, which has taken some geolocated photos from a video that was released a couple of days ago, where Russian forces were building up forces here in the southwest of Persh-Travneve, where they were building up their forces trying to launch attacks towards the Ukrainian positions here to the southwest, after which they were hit by Ukrainian targeted strikes. We then move further south in the direction of Avdiivka, where here in the northern front we see that the Russian forces managed to attack in the direction of Stepove and managed to advance through the railways. This is again another attempt by the Russian forces to attack in the direction of Stepove after the Ukrainian forces counterattacked and managed to regain control over the village. So we're seeing that fighting is taking place in the northern flanks by Stepove, and if we take a look at these images here, we see from this image here that this is the outlook of the Russian forces fighting here in this direction. The Russian forces have control up to this area right here. There's this forest line that goes northwards. So fighting is taking place within this forest line by the Russian and Ukrainian forces on each their own end of it. Further north, we see that there is this gap here where there's a wider part of the forest area. This is a location where there's a lot of troops located, as with the cover of these forest areas there's a lot more opportunity for either side to build trenches and fortifications there to then launch attacks or defend their positions from there. However, considering we're now in the start of December, all of the leaves are gone, which leaves much less cover than a couple of months ago, and this is likely why we see the Russian forces successfully pushing through the railways, because due to lack of cover, due to the falling of the leaves, it became much easier for the Russian forces to push through during the month of November. And taking a look at this picture here, we see Stepove here on the left side and Berdishi here in front of us, and we see that there is this singular forest line that goes through here the central parts. Other than that, there's not really that much cover. It's just open fields ahead of the villages, and the height elevation is barely visible due to how flat it is and how wide the field is. There's no straight increase in elevation. It's a very slight gradual elevation that allows either side to have a clear view over the whole area. This is why it became very difficult for the Russian forces to advance here at the start of November / at the end of October. So now we're seeing that fighting continues here in this direction towards Stepove, as the open fields next to it is much more difficult to push through, as the Ukrainian forces have many prepared defenses all across this area, including tunnels and trenches, which makes it difficult to advance. The Stepove direction, there's at the very least some forest lines next to it, at the sides of it, as well as the buildings themselves, which allow for more cover, therefore making it easier to hold positions in the area rather than here by the fields. Talking about fields, it becomes easier the more we go into the winter months to use these fields for armored movement, as we see with the weather. First off, in Kupiansk, where already from Monday at night all throughout Friday next week, the weather will be below the freezing point, and therefore the ground will slowly, bit by bit, freeze over, which will allow for armored vehicles to drive through the muddy fields, because the mud will freeze and therefore it will be traversable again. And same with Avdiivka already from Monday night. It'll be constantly in the negatives all throughout Friday. If this trend continues for a week or two more beyond what we already see, then it is likely that the ground will freeze over and it'll allow for armored vehicles to drive through the fields, and therefore we may see a restart of armored movements all throughout the northern front of Avdiivka in the direction of Marinka, Kupiansk, and so on, including in the Zaporizhzhia front. Well, let's go back to the direction of Marinka, where we here see that the Russian forces managed to make a significant breakthrough, and this is likely as a result of Ukrainian forces retreating out of the city. It is reported earlier today that the Ukrainian forces left the city, and since then there's popped this video out where we see A drone flying over Marinka, which is by now covered in snow due to the snowstorm that happened last week all throughout southern Ukraine and Russia. And we see here that the drone flies through the western parts of the city, and towards the end of the route, we see a Russian flag in one of the final buildings at the very western edge of the city. And that is what I've marked as the progress of the Russian forces within the city. Moving on, we see that it flies around and looks at the neighboring houses, and there doesn't seem to be any movement in these areas. This could indicate either that only small amounts of soldiers are located within the city, or that the Ukrainian forces have completely left the city, and that is due to the fact that the drone is allowed to fly this far up to the front line, and that the flag is present indicates that Russian soldiers have already advanced to this point, which means that the Russian forces have managed to capture the western part of the city, and therefore it is likely that Marinka will fall within today. With the fall of Marinka being so close and so likely, we see that it is reasonable to say that the Russian next target would be Pobieda here to the south, after which there would be no Ukrainian positions except for the line of villages here in the central parts of the Donetsk region, as well as to the west of Marinka. Therefore, it is likely that the Russian forces will push towards Pobieda, try to capture it, and launch attacks towards Novomikhailivka from the north and the south, as well as westwards from Marinka, continuing the operations here in the direction. Marinka, although being a heavily fortified city, the fighting has taken place for almost 10 years now. Therefore, it is largely destroyed, as we saw in the video, leaving almost no defensible value within the city, and therefore the Russian and Ukrainian positions here are very weak. Despite the ongoing fighting, this is likely why the Ukrainian forces, after this long, decided to abandon the city. However, this has a huge influence on the morale of the Ukrainian forces, because Marinka itself has been a bastion of Ukrainian defense. It is a city that has seen fighting since the very start of the outbreak of the Ukrainian civil war. Therefore, we see that with the fall of Marinka, the Russian forces will gain a morale boost, specifically the DPR forces, and the Ukrainian forces will have a morale hit. The Ukrainian forces have now changed their strategies, and this has been mentioned publicly by Zelensky, who says that the Ukrainian forces will now switch to the defense. After months of Zelensky pressing Zelensky to switch the strategy to defense, it has finally taken place. This is likely why we see that the only fighting that has really taken place is positional fighting by the Ukrainian forces to try and slow down or negate Russian advances through the last month of November. Therefore, we will unlikely see more fighting here in the Zaporizhia front unless the Russian forces start a counterattack after the end of the Ukrainian offensive, or we will most likely see the fighting continuing here by the direction of Donetsk itself, in the flanks of Avdiivka and the city of Marinka, as well as in the direction of Bakhmut and Kupiansk, where all of these will be focuses of the Russian forces to try and advance in these directions. We may even see fighting taking place in the direction of Uledar again. This is why I think it is very important to make a 3D analysis of the city, as it is clearly a target of the Russian forces. They want to gain control over Uledar, which will allow them to then pressure the Ukrainian possessions here in the south of the Donetsk region. Because in the end, Donetsk itself is a target for the Russian army. They have that as a war goal, taking control over the borders of the Donetsk region. Therefore, we will likely see offensive operations continue here in the Donetsk region all throughout 2024, as the Russian forces will try to gain full control over it. We will also likely see offensive operations in the direction of Zaporizhia, as with the annexation of the region by the Russian forces, they also have that as a goal to capture and gain control over the region. We'll also likely see a lot more fighting by the Kherson-Dnieper River area, as both sides will continue to assert their enemies' offensive capabilities to try and prevent the Russians, the Ukrainians, from crossing the Dnieper River and launching an attack there, and the Russians try to attract the Ukrainian forces defending this section of the front line to try and put some pressure, forcing the Ukrainians to relocate troops to this direction, which will weaken other parts of the front line. So we're seeing that fighting will continue all throughout the front line through 2024 and in the final months of 2023, where the Russian forces now definitely and clearly are on the offensive. And with that, we will end off this video. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.